My name is Jessica Juarez, and welcome to my presentation on Jews settling in America. Before I start, I would like to note two things. First, I have structured my presentation chronologically from 17th century up to the 1930s. And lastly, I will only be highlighting the main events in Jewish experience in America, as covering all of Jewish history in the United States would take much more than my short presentation. In September 1654, 23 Jewish refugees from Brazil stepped ashore in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. This group consisted of Jewish men, women, and children, and were fleeing from the Portuguese Inquisition taking over Brazil. Because this group was a rather large group, they needed approval of local authorities, namely the governor of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant, a devout member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and his superiors in Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company. Unfortunately, when the groups of Jews approached the governor, Stuyvesant had no intentions of letting the Jews stay. In a letter addressed to his superiors in Amsterdam, he claimed Jews would engage in their customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians. They would destroy the Christian character of the colony by practicing their religion, since Jews were hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And their poverty, he claimed, would make them a burden to the community. In response to Stuyvesant's letter, Jews also wrote their letters to Amsterdam. Their letter was not addressed directly to the Dutch West India Company, but rather to the Jews of Amsterdam, which according to Diner enjoyed a relatively high level of religious tolerance. When the Jews of Amsterdam received the letter, they went into action immediately and wrote a very powerful letter to the director of the Dutch West India Company. In this letter, they brought up the issue to their attention of the officials and stated multiple reasons why they should consider the Jews in New Amsterdam to stay. Those reasons consisted that Jews would be a benefit to the company because that meant extra labor, extra hands for extra labor, and second, they could not go to Spain or Portugal because of the Inquisition. Lastly, many of the Jewish nations are principal shareholders in the West India Company, a big key factor that let them stay. In the end, this was enough for the officials of Old Amsterdam to give orders to Governor Stuyvesant to let the Jews stay in April 1955. Stuyvesant, angry with the order, had no choice but to follow through. But that didn't stop him to find a loophole in the event. Although he was given orders to let the Jews stay, there was nothing to prohibit him from setting restrictions on them. Jews were allowed to stay, but didn't have complete freedom in New Amsterdam. In the letter instructing Stuyvesant for the Jews to stay, the Dutch East India Company did in fact place one restriction themselves, and that was Jews needed to take care of their poor. Stuyvesant and the council, on the other hand, in 1655, Stuyvesant and the council governing the colony barred Jews from participating in the lucrative Indian trade. Jews were also prohibited from training with the guards and from participating in the defense of the colony. Stuyvesant also imposed a law in which Jews were required to pay a special tax to receive protection from the Dutch army. However, the most degrading one of them all was that Stuyvesant banned Jews from trading outside the city limits and were banned from building houses and have any type of symbols which reflected permanent residence. This is an issue because prohibiting the building of your own home is prohibiting them from settling properly. However, although Jews had a rocky start in New Amsterdam, Asser Levy is someone I wanted to include in this presentation because he truly was a notable man. He was determined, who single-handedly became a voice for the Jewish community. He petitioned for bigger and better opportunities for Jews and petitioned against the tax held on Jews. By 1657, Jews had the right to citizenship, and some limitations were dropped. Fast forward to independent United States. When the first president of the United States visited Rhode Island in 1790, Moses Sixtus Warden and the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, wrote a letter addressed to George Washington, welcoming him and introducing themselves on behalf of the Jewish community. In the letter he states, "Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and join you with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport." Clearly, they wanted Washington to know that they appreciated everything that the American government and Washington has done, especially when it comes to civil and religious liberties. In George Washington's response letter, it is safe to say that the Jewish identity was strengthened and gave them conformity. In this letter, he states, "While I receive with much satisfaction your address replete with expression of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that shall always retain a grateful remembrance of cordial welcome I experienced in my visit to Newport from all class of citizens." And his world famous line, "For happily the government of the United States which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should deem themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasion their effectual support." To this day, this letter remains as one of the most proudest and prized possessions in American Jewish history. George Washington's letter in general holds the power and value to bring the nation together. I have divided Jewish identity into two time periods, 1654 to 1820 and 1820 to 1920. Based on the research I have accumulated, these periods are unique in their own way, and I believe they should be highlighted and studied separately. In the first group, from 1654 to 1820, this period of Jewish identity can be characterized as a desperate one. I say this because Jews in America were in such few numbers. They couldn't quite rely on one another but themselves. Also, I think it's important to mention that the majority of Jews during this period were Sephardic Jews. Although Jews had the freedom to practice their religion, they had to practice discreetly, meaning they couldn't have any type of symbols on the outside that revealed them as Jews. As Diner quotes in her book, Jews were allowed to hold services as long as they exercised in all quietness their religion within their houses. It wouldn't be until 1682 that Jews would be permitted to mark off a special place for communal religious worship. Although they couldn't have a proper synagogue architecture, in 1655 they were granted permission to have cemeteries. Jews did not have their own rabbis, and they won't for a really long time. They also didn't have their own Torah. However, they did import one from Amsterdam. And so, in the meantime, they had to rely on oral teachings. For the most part, there was a growing tolerance towards Jews during this period. Jews lived near ports, and this was because they engaged in commercial activities and made a living in trade. One of the advantages of being a Jew during this time was the fact that they could rely on family and the community for business negotiations. An example Hasia Diner tells in her book is, a Jew from Barbados arriving to Philadelphia could come with a letter and introduce to local Jews who could then help them, newcomers, get started in a business venture or in filling an order of goods to be taken to yet another port. I thought this was super fascinating because the fact that, another example, in New York, they could rely on importations from Jamaica to bring in kosher food is really fascinating. It's something you don't really think about every day. Within this strategy, Jews held a strong network of partners and businesses and could help one another grow. And I mean literally. Because with these strong connections, many business partners married off their sons and daughters together to keep the family and business even closer. In addition to Jews settling near port cities, is that Jews also settled in places where religious affiliation did not correlate with the privilege. For example, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there was also no proper Jewish community that settled there during this period because of that same reason. Another thing that I would like to highlight is that the relationship between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews was a rather cooperative one. Due to the low population of Jews during the first 2 centuries in America, there was no such thing as Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, and I mean separate communities. They both lived together because that was all they had, including marrying each other. And although the Sephardic group did not want to necessarily cooperate with the Ashkenazic group, they did so because of the agreement they had agreed to prior to this. They needed to take care of their poor. The differences that existed between these two groups in Europe did not exist in America. In America, they spoke the same language, lived in the same community, shared the same synagogue, and shared the same social life. Remember how I mentioned America did not have a rabbi to run the synagogue and perform rituals traditionally performed by a rabbi? Well, it wasn't until 1840 when the Baltimore Hebrew congregation imported its first ordained rabbi to America. His name was Rabbi Abraham Rice from Bavaria. Aside from holding the title of first rabbi, he also continued to increase the Jewish identity. But before I move on, I just want to emphasize how from 1654 until 1840, Jews in America did not have a rabbi, which says a lot in itself how close the Jewish community supported itself, even without a high figure leader to lead them. Back to Rabbi Abraham Rice. According to a quote by Diner, in a letter sent to his teacher back to Bavaria, Rabbi Rice said, "I live in complete darkness. The religious life in this land," he continued, "is on the lowest level. Most people eat foul food and desecrate the Sabbath in public. Thousands marry non-Jewish women. I wonder whether it is even permissible for a Jew to live in this land." Because of this, he began to create drastic changes among the Jewish community. He became so strict to the point where he demanded that the board censured members who desecrated the Sabbath. This angered many people and left the congregation at once. I said that Rabbi Rice is responsible for dividing the Jewish community because after these people left, the birth of the Reform movement started. Now, there are two movements, the Orthodox and the Reform. Many people were okay with this. However, many didn't quite find that balance. The main plan was to have only two movements. However, in 1913, the conservative movement was created to create that balance, emphasizing the binding nature of Jewish law while at the same time enjoying the benefits of the American society. So, in American Jewish history, the conservative movement is the youngest of the three. During the American Civil War, Jews found themselves between a double-edged sword. They weren't sure which side of the conflict to be loyal to. Approximately 10,000 Jews served in the Civil War, 7,000 in the Union, and 3,000 in the Confederate Army. The nation was divided, which meant so were Jews. For the most part, Jews sided with the army that was most convenient for them. I mean, who wouldn't in time of war? Depending of which army was in control of the land your home was in, that'd be the army that you join. For Jews, slavery wasn't the main reason they joined. In fact, according to a 1703 census in New York, 75% of the Jewish household contained slaves, averaging about two per family. And by the time of the Civil War, not much had changed. While serving in the Civil War, many Jews also faced many issues with their religion because it was very difficult as for asking for permission and convincing a Christian society of allowing them to have their Jewish customs and traditions, especially at a time of war. So for many soldiers, while they couldn't get kosher food or celebrate Passover properly, they had to resort and improvise. It was also during the Civil War where General Ulysses Grant shocked the nation with General Order Number 11 on December 17, 1862, in which he ordered the expulsion of all Jews within 24 hours in the military district of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. However, fortunately for Jews, Abraham Lincoln repealed this order and declared it unconstitutional. Between 1820 and 1920, there were two major waves of migration in the history of the United States. In reference to Jews, both waves were distinct in their own way. The first wave of Jews to the United States constituted of mostly young men, from 1820 to the Civil War. According to Diner, they were considered desirable because of the contribution they can make towards the colony and towards its defense. The second wave of immigration was different and the biggest. Starting post-Civil War to 1920s, Jews no longer migrated individually. This time, families migrated together. However, I should also clarify that before an entire family would migrate blindly to a new country, they did send a member from the family before they could settle and go their entirety. The reason for migrating in both waves was mainly because of the decline of local economy and for better opportunities. Just like in the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement divided the Jews in America. While many reform and some conservative institutions and synagogues got involved in the Civil Rights movement, many Orthodox rabbis argued that politics is not their place. Nevertheless, in 1963, over 200 Reform conservative and Orthodox rabbis participated in the historic March on Washington, and Jewish organization heaped award on with Martin Luther King Jr., a featured speaker at numerous programs sponsored by Jewish organizations. Jews in the South suffered the most consequences during the Civil Rights Movement. Although many Northerners wanted the best for the nation, their actions were greatly affecting the Southern Jews. The business and partners Jews from the South had worked really hard to earn was all going down the drain because the Jews from the North spoke loudly against the South. Because of this, the white supremacists took it out on the Southern Jews by destroying their businesses and murdering them too. At this point, it became dangerous to be a Jew in the South. Nevertheless, many Jewish civil rights leaders emerged during this period as well, most notably Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In 1965, Heschel joined with Martin Luther King Jr. to make the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Heschel, considered one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the 20th century, declared that civil rights grew out of the prophetic tradition. I think this statement is very important because Jews, at least the majority, were white. So was the advantage from the beginning, which was their advantage from the beginning of the country. Had they had another skin color, the history of Jews in America would probably be different. The period between 1820 and 1920 is considered to be the pivotal point to shape Jewish identity in America. During this time, America as a whole was facing a period of figuring out their own identity. Due to the mass migration during the 1820s, America was experiencing a cultural boom from every part of the world. Among the many people that were migrating, many were Jews. From the period between 1820 to roughly 1865, Jews were still living near ports and in rural societies. The linking of rural towns and large cities by railroad was only becoming a new thing. Nevertheless, however, Jews were still not leaving the city. Instead, throughout the years, they were leaving little by little for the next 8 decades toward the cities. The majority of Jews were businessmen, so not many left to the Midwest either to become farmers. It's also very interesting to know that by the 1820s, a majority of Americans had never seen a Jew. This would play a huge factor on the treatment they would get in the future. Many new organizations started forming, such as the B'nai B'rith Foundation in 1843, the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1889 to help the community with the commitment to the Jewish life, and the Federation of American Zionists, supporting the creation of the State of Israel. By the 1920s, New York City was home to the largest Jewish community, housing about 45% of all Jews in America. After the 1920s, there was a division between the old and new generation. While the old generation consisted of members from the first and second wave of migration, the new generation were the children of those immigrants. They didn't know life other than American. They grew up surrounded by American fashion, media, and education. To remedy this nostalgic gap during the migration of the second wave, due to many and the majority of population coming from the Eastern Europe hemisphere, the Yiddish culture became popular culture among the Jewish community. The Yiddish culture was a sensation and blossomed everything from the Yiddish vaudeville to Yiddish literary art theater. In the quote from Sharon Power's article, Yiddish in the article Yiddish Theater Actresses and American Jewish Identity, she states, Yiddish theater was a space for making sense of the immigrant experience, depicting familiar conflicts and the tension between old world traditions and life in America, with its new freedom and pressure, as well as scenes of old world Jewish ways of life which the immigrants had left behind and still mourned. The theater provided a nostalgic, cathartic, and communal experience to help the community cope with feelings of homesickness, guilt, and loss. Unfortunately, in 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, restricting immigration basing it on a quota system. From this point forward, migration, especially for Jewish immigrants, became drastically reduced. To describe this period in one word, that would be a sense of belonging. I believe that if Jews were not prohibited from the beginning, building their own homes in New Amsterdam, America would probably have had avoided many issues. Jews may have been perhaps better accepted, and history would probably have had a different course. These are my thoughts. And I think that one of the most impressive aspects about my entire research I've done is finding out that for nearly 2 centuries, Jews did not have a rabbi. I thought to myself, how fascinating that is. Jews were able to organize and communicate with other Jews from different parts of the world and support one another. If one congregation needed a Torah, another congregation would let them borrow it. The struggle of Jews wanting to have a sense of belonging is something that is highlighted by George Washington's letter, and the new generation of Jews in America. I have also concluded that Jewish identity to this day remains an issue. Would they consider themselves Jewish American or American Jewish? Even after all these centuries later, discrimination and stereotypes still shadow Jews to this day. It should also be kept in mind that Jews were in the United States before the United States became a country. They were there for every stage this nation has grown. They fought against the British to gain independence. They fought in the Civil War and continue to fight in the Civil Rights Movement. There really isn't anything they weren't part of. They all did their best so they could give the Jewish community a good name. I think it is safe to say that for millions of Jews and the millions of sacrifices they have made, they have done it to make this world a better place. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. And thank you for watching. And I hope you have a great summer.